all of them treading desire paths in a country of between, listening to what shifts underfoot. Their shadows overlap, sitting late at kitchen tables, or on Sundays in bus stations at the edge of small towns where the fountains have rusted, cement dust drifting, a few dead leaves, restless, then still, and one hand passes into another, a suitcase of faded photographs, recipes, account books, letters to unknown addresses. That's part of a poem from Fleet, my second new Carcanet collection. That path doesn't actually appear in Fleet, although the book is full of paths and journeys. It's a path near to where I live, and a path that I walk. And it's the kind of place that, to use Roy Fisher's phrase, is really what I think with. It's the kind of place that matters a great deal to me. The path was used by people going to and from the mills. The mills have all vanished now, that way of life has gone. But what remains is these paths, and in particular, and what I love about it, is the hollows that they wore into all those flagstones, so that you can see these hollowed out stones, almost as if they've left there the weight of their working lives, the weight of their bodies is still contained there in the stone.
What is it about these sorts of traces that interests you, Judith?
It's those hollows, it's those marks left by where people have passed through. I'm very interested in the idea of the past as being a kind of process of moving through, of transactions, of movement through time and through place as well, exchange, what people carry with them, what they leave, what's given away and remade in different forms. Those kinds of things seem very important to me. There's a term, trace fossils, that's used for fossils that aren't fossils of creatures, but fossils of the marks that they've left behind, things like footprints. And those seem to me enormously powerful, the sense that something has been there, it's vanished, but it's left behind the marks of its passing. And I feel that in these kinds of places where you find these traces, absence becomes a very powerful thing. It becomes a presence, actually, that you can feel.
How did the new book come about?
Well, in a way I hadn't expected at all. Somebody in my family became very interested in family history and was sending me all sorts of bits and pieces, which were interesting, but as a peripheral thing, it didn't have anything to do with my writing. And then suddenly this story emerged. My grandmother's grandmother, this is back in the late 19th century, was a woman called Eliza, who married a man who was a migrant. He was a foreigner in London, and he had a shop near the docks in London, selling exotic birds and other curios. He called himself dealer in foreign birds and curiosities.
That's fascinating. Was that unusual then at the time?
No, it wasn't at all unusual. There were a lot of shops like that in port cities and in London, because birds and other animals, livestock, they were part of the commodities of empire. It was a really big trade. They were the natural resources of empire that could be bought or you might say plundered, perhaps more accurately, and sold. They contributed to the wealth of Britain. They were imported as dead creatures, in which case they were simply raw materials. They were used in fashion and in manufacture. And they were imported in huge numbers as live animals. They were sold for pets. People collected them. It was a fashion to have exotic birds and if you were wealthy, other animals as well. They were sold to zoos and museums as well, and to rich collectors who would have private collections. And I was very interested in the way that birds in particular, whose life consists of movement, were being sold by a man who was himself a migrant. And birds, of course, can be migratory, which calls into question the whole idea of any fixed categories of native and foreign. Where is home for a bird that migrates? But there was another strand to this story, which really was, I knew I had to write about it. I didn't know it was going to become a whole book at that time, but I thought, I have to write about this. I have to try to understand this. Eliza, like most people, would have passed through history with barely a ripple. She was a woman. She was certainly illiterate. She signed her marriage certificate with a cross because she couldn't write her name. She had no contact at all with the sort of large public history of her time, except at one point, because she ended up in a magistrate's court accused of having abandoned two of her children who were aged 2 and 3. She denied the charge. She said she'd left them with her husband, but she was sent to prison. And at that point, her life collided with the large written history of her time. Because she was in court, this was written up in an East End newspaper, the report from the magistrate's court. It has to be said that this wasn't a kind of front page scandal by any means. The striking thing is that it was one report. It's about an inch of text in a column. In a whole column of such reports from the courts of people who committed sad, sort of banal crimes, desperate crimes of abandoning children, which wasn't uncommon, and petty theft, non-payment of rent, this sort of thing. That really became something that I had to explore, and in particular the fact that after that she simply disappears again. She lived for quite a long time after that. She died in the workhouse, and there is no trace whatsoever of the children. The person who was doing this research was never able to find what had happened to them. So the whole thing is silent. There's an evasiveness in it. The truth is unknowable. It sort of falls away into silence.
So how did you turn all of that material into a collection of poems, and why poems rather than a novel, for example?
Well, I'm not a novelist, and there are a lot of things novels do that I don't know how to do, would be a very simple answer. But what was important to me was the story's unknowability, and that was actually what I wanted to incorporate into the poems. I'm always more interested in narratives that are eroded, that are open, and that change in the reading of them. And that's something that I think poems can do. I wanted these to be fragmentary glimpses. I spent a lot of time actually trying to find ways of getting away from narrative and to let in that silence, that unknowability. Obviously there had to be some narrative, otherwise it wouldn't have made any sense at all. But I had to sort of write out of any tendency to write something that was like a novel, but wouldn't have been any good as a novel. You know, there's a huge kind of shadow of Dickens that falls over this sort of material, which I had to get rid of. I had to stop writing poems about soot. And I had to get away from any kind of costume drama. I really didn't want to spend a lot of time getting the details of what kind of shoes people would have worn right for the date. So it was a question of finding voices for the book, really, and of actually writing into it my own process, which became an important thing. I disappeared for a time down a lot of rabbit holes of historical material. I really read more books, more 19th century books about keeping exotic birds than anybody needs to do. So I had to sort of dig my way out of that and find a way of bringing that material to bear on this story without it swamping it. But one thing that did do was it gave me some kind of language I could use. There's quite a lot of found text in the poems. For example, it struck me very forcibly how a lot of the writing in these books about keeping birds was written from a position of power, possession, and was often highly gendered. Birds were spoken about as being sulky or coquettish, or meek or stubborn. Those kinds of words were used very often. They were praised for being teachable or good nest builders.
You talked about language, Judith, and there's a sense almost that there's a language of fairy tale in Fleet. Is that something you were conscious of when writing?
Yes, that was absolutely deliberate. It was a way of finding a language for this story. I didn't write all the poems in a fairy tale kind of way, but the story has a sort of fairy tale element to it of these lost children. But more than that, I think fairy tales have always been stories of dispossession, of orphan children, of people who have to make their way in their world and through their own cunning and their wit, who are subject to arbitrary power. A lot of fairy tales deal with the idea of having to leave your home and make a journey and survive on good luck and your own wits, your own resources. So that seemed to me a way into this material, because it was it had a sense of a kind of archetypal history to it. It gave me a voice for the children because I wanted them to be present there, and yet they weren't present, they were lost. So fairy tale gave me a kind of ghostly voice for them. The other thing that is very important about fairy tales is that they exist in their own time and place. They exist in a time that's slightly at an angle to the real world. And I wanted that freedom to move around in time. I wanted to be anachronistic if necessary. I wanted to be able to play fast and loose with geography if necessary, and there is a certain evasiveness in those things sometimes in Fleet. That was part of it for me. And I wanted to be able to move from what could have been just a kind of historical story into the present, to make that connection. When I went to the city where I think the bird dealer came from, which is a port on the Adriatic, and I wrote poems there, that's a city that has now a very high migrant population that refugees still try to reach or die trying to reach, and they pass through or they settle there. Some of those people will, in due course, come to London. So fairy tale could sort of open the story up to that kind of movement through time.
Judith, shaping a book like this seems like an impossible task. How did you actually bring everything together?
Yes, well, there were times when it seemed an impossible task to me as well. I think a key moment was actually finding out more about the Thames. Water is very important in the book. Rivers have always been a sort of image of time and flow. The Thames is a tidal river, of course, so it has that circularity to it. And there really was a key moment when somebody explained to me about the currents in the Thames and how objects in the Thames are brought back. And you can find objects on the foreshore. As I did, I picked things up. And these things are, again, they're fragments, they're silences. We don't know what they meant to the people who lost them, but they mean something now about a life that's gone, the whole sort of industrial life of the Thames. So that gave me a kind of shape for the book. I wanted it to include my own process of searching, and so it has a kind of circular shape. That the poems in the first part deal with the specific story, and the poems in the last part of the book widen out to move through time and place. But in the middle of the book, between those two sections, there's a prose section, because I wanted to explore my own part in this and how we make stories out of the past, and what it means to make those stories, to remember, and also what's important about forgetting.